Welcome to the second lecture of week 2. Welcome to Cleveland. This one is going to be another short lecture, and it has a sort of a singular theme that I want to draw out from it, and that's the theme of loyalty. Perhaps irrational loyalty, if we want to go back into a rational or irrational discussion. Irrational loyalty and sort of suffering through decades of losing. Now, obviously, this article was written well before Cleveland won a title, before the Seahawks won a title, and before the Cubs won a title. So three sort of perennial losers finally actually won shortly after this was written. So I am fully aware of that, but I think it's still worthy of discussion because there's still plenty of losers out there. So let's press on. There's plenty to still talk about and plenty to relate to. So one of the things that got brought up in the story is that the pain brings you back. So the idea of there's always waiting for next year. We've put in all this suffering. How could we go away now? In some ways, you can think of this as hope. In some ways, you can think of it as a gambler's mentality. I've already spent so much on this slot machine. How could I walk away right now if the next win is just one pull away or one quarter away or $1 away? Always wanting sort of the hope of looking what might come next and seeing the years of suffering as maybe an investment in what will eventually become the enjoyment. They also talked about sort of part of the enjoyment is surrendering your control. This might take us back to some earlier discussions about identity, and if it is an outward-in identity of where our actions and our attitudes and our dress and our attire are things that we surround us with, if those are the items that define our identity, or if identity is sort of deep within us and kind of exudes out of us or just comes out of us and is not really even under our control. It's just who we are. So this might move us back into sort of surrendering control. This is who our identity is. It isn't even a choice anymore. I have to cheer for the Cleveland Indians or the Cavaliers because I am a native Clevelander and that's just what I have to do. Now, as we're trying to start to draw these readings together a little bit more, this idea of hope or waiting for next year, if we think about sports fandom as an extension of our own identity, so I am so bought into the Cleveland Cavaliers that they are, in some ways, me. Their losses I feel personally, their wins I feel personally. So it's really a defense of self, is this hope. So in other aspects of your life, you always maintain hope of finding, if you're single, finding the relationship, if that's what you're going after. If you're currently unemployed, there's hope of finding the job or landing the great life that you've always wanted. There's always this sort of hope, and it's really in defense of your own self-identity, your own self-worth. So having hope in a perennial loser of a sports team is in many ways the same thing. So if you are sort of struggling through relationships year after year after year, there's always sort of hope that you'll find the diamond in the rough, or whatever metaphor you might want to use. There's always hope that around the corner is the one thing that you've been waiting for. And that's the same sort of hope that we have for our sports teams. So it seems like it's a very sort of easy transition in thinking to think about it in terms of defense of your own self-worth, identity, your own goals, to have that sort of hope, always waiting for next year, even though I know this one didn't work out, but that's going to make it so much sweeter when I do find success on the basketball court, or my team finds success on the basketball court, or hoping and waiting this long is going to make it so much more worth it when I find that right person or that right job or whatever other sort of deep identity connection that you have. So theoretically, this piece was a little bit lighter than some of the other ones this week, but I want you to talk a little bit about this idea of loyalty and suffering. The underlying theme is loyalty, but loyalty through suffering is even more important than just sort of loyalty with moderate success. So here's your second discussion item. Does suffering through losing make a better fan? Talk about what perennial losing does to a fan base. Second, talk about what staying loyal to losers means to a fan base. So it's one thing just to sort of suffer through it, but what sort of deeper meaning and almost pride in staying loyal to losers? What's that dynamic? Talk about that for a little bit. And then third, are any of your favorite teams losers? What does that mean for you? What if they never win? talk about that. Talk about sort of if there is never kind of that sunset or that rainbow pot of gold, whatever you want to call it. If it's not worth the wait, if your team loses until the day you die, is it still worth it? Looking back on your deathbed, is it still worth it to have cheered for that team the whole way through? So then the story, after talking about sort of the suffering and what it does to maybe fans, they moved into a different place where they're talking about pride, and not just pride in a team, but more of a pride of a community or a region or sort of a culture or imagined community of people. So it isn't just that we're losing, but we are all losing together. So they may be losers, but they're our losers. So they're a lot of the Chicago Cubs culture had sort of the lovable losers before they won the World Series, where they were all sort of in it together. And that was really a community building experience for them, a shared experience, which is sort of a necessary component of an imagined community, is having shared experiences, both good and bad. So they had the shared experiences of a century or so of losing, and in some cases losing sort of remarkably, in remarkable fashion. So the losing itself, yes, we might receive sort of a ding to our ego or our esteem, but we're so used to it that it's more of a pride in just being proud, or being proud of our pride, or however you want to phrase it, where it isn't necessarily even that the team needs to win anymore. It's just that we're all in this so much together. Our community has been strengthened over the years, or hardened over the years so much by all of our losing, that the wins and losses, we're just expecting a loss. So our identity is kind of shielded from losing. We just expect a loss, and that way any wins that do come can be sort of celebrated without having to put too much of our ego on the line, because, yeah, we know they're going to lose, but we're still all of this community together. And then still somehow transitioning that into this righteous, joyous moment when the Cubs do win the World Series, so that shared suffering for a century, followed by the exuberation of, like, I've been cheering for this team for 65 years, and they finally won kind of moment. Now, I would say it might be that Cleveland had even more on the line due to so many other hardships in other parts of people's life, of Clevelanders' lives. All the economic hardships that hit kind of the Rust Belt and the factory jobs in the city itself, mismanagement in the city, sort of the impoverished members of the city and the lowered status of the city in America. So a lot of different places where Clevelanders' ego, self-esteem, whatever you want to call it, has been diminished. So that the title by the Cavaliers really meant more to Cleveland than a lot of other cities that maybe haven't had so many other identity-bashing hardships happen to them over the last few decades.